30 years ago, inside a garage in Seattle that smelled of sawdust and old paper, a single extension cord snaked across the floor to power a lonely, noisy server. Jesus stood in the corner of that cold workspace, watching Jeff wrap a cardboard box with shaking but determined hands. He wasn't just mailing a book. He was mailing a promise that the world would eventually come to his doorstep. He wasn't looking at the small check in his hand. He was looking at a clock that ticked once every 10,000 years. Back then, the world was a place of now. People wanted results in a day, a week, or a month. They called his dreams Amazon.toast and laughed at his empty pockets. But Jeff? He was like a man planting a redwood tree in a field of weeds. He knew that if you are willing to be misunderstood for a long time, you can build a cathedral where others only see a shack. He saw a future where every object on earth, every toy, every tool, every garment, could be summoned by a single click. He planted a seed that the market called profitless, but the divine called it the discipline of the harvest. The investors grumbled, "Where is the money? Why are you building so many warehouses?" But Jesus smiled, because he knew the secret of the desert. The greatest rivers start as a single drop that refuses to evaporate. Jeff wasn't building a store, he was building the infrastructure of human desire. He spent his nights obsessed with the customer, treating every stranger's convenience as if it were a holy commandment. He understood that while technologies change, the human heart's desire for speed and abundance never does. The garage was dark and the desk was made of an old door. But in that shadow, the everything store was already written in the stars. 15 years ago, inside a massive concrete cathedral of steel and conveyor belts, the air hummed with the electric pulse of a million moving parts. Jesus stood amidst the towering yellow bins and the relentless whir of the sorters, watching Jeff look at a stopwatch, measuring the seconds between a wish and its fulfillment. He wasn't just managing a logistics network. He was perfecting the flywheel. He realized that in the kingdom of commerce, friction is the enemy of the soul, and he was determined to burn every obstacle away. Back then, the world was still bound by the limits of waiting. We accepted that things took time to arrive, that the out-of-stock sign was a fact of life. But Jeff? He was like a commander of a silent army that never slept. He built a labyrinth of warehouses that spanned the continents, turning the map of the world into a giant vending machine. He didn't just want to sell you a book. He wanted to own the very air through which your desires traveled. He planted a seed that the workers called the grind, but the divine called it the pursuit of the absolute. The headlines grew sharp. The machines are replacing the people. The pace is too fast. Where is the heart? But Jesus smiled, because he knew the burden of the provider. To feed a multitude, one must first master the art of the harvest, even if the harvest is made of silicon and sweat. For this expansion, Jeff became the architect of the infinite shelf. He traded the sweater of the academic for the vest of the laborer, walking the concrete floors until his boots were worn thin. He obsessed over the last mile, knowing that the final few steps to a doorway are the hardest steps in the universe. He spent his nights looking at heat maps of global demand, ensuring that when a child cried for a toy or a mother needed bread, the prime machinery was already in motion before the prayer was even finished. In the blurred motion of the delivery vans racing against the sun, the gears of instant gratification started to click. It was efficient. It was ruthless. It was a miracle of organization. Jeff was proving that a grain of wheat, if it is harnessed to a wheel that never stops turning, can feed a planet while the rest of the world is still asleep. The warehouses were vast and the light was artificial, but in that mechanical dance, the prophet of the long now was rewriting the heartbeat of human civilization. 5 years ago, in the quiet, shimmering heat of the West Texas desert, a silver needle of steel stood defiant against the vast, empty sky. Jesus stood at the edge of the launch pad, watching Jeff step out of his high-speed life and look upward, toward the silent heavens. He wasn't just building a rocket. He was building a road to space. He realized that the Earth is a precious, fragile cradle, but humanity was never meant to stay in the cradle forever. Back then, the world saw a billionaire playing with expensive toys. They saw a rivalry of egos in the clouds and asked, "Why look up when there is so much broken down here?" But Jeff? He was like a grandfather planting a forest he would never walk in. He wasn't racing for the moon for his own glory. He was building the heavy lifting machinery for the next million entrepreneurs. He spoke of O'Neill colonies and floating cities, believing that to save the earth we must move the heavy industry into the light of the stars. He planted a seed that the world called Blue Origin, but the divine called it the Ark of the New Era. He traded his business suit for a flight suit, feeling the bone-shaking roar of the engines as he finally crossed the Kármán line. But Jesus smiled, because he knew the perspective of the heights. When you look back from the blackness of space, there are no borders, no warehouses, and no prime memberships, only one blue marble glowing with the breath of God. For this ascent, Jeff became the architect of the infinite frontier. He spent his nights studying the physics of reusable fire, knowing that a bridge to the stars must be affordable or it will remain a dream for the few. He moved with the motto Gradatim Ferociter, step by step ferociously. He was proving that the long now isn't just about centuries on Earth, but about the millennia of human expansion across the solar system. In the weightless silence of the cabin as he floated above the atmosphere, the gears of cosmic stewardship started to click. It was a homecoming. It was a baptism in the void. Jeff was proving that a grain of wheat, if it is willing to be carried by the wind of a rocket, can find a new field among the planets. The descent was fast and the desert was hot. But as his boots touched the dust again, the man who sold everything realized that the most valuable thing he owned was the vision of a future that hasn't happened yet. Present day, deep inside a mountain in West Texas where the silence is as old as the stone itself, a massive stainless steel gear turns with a slow, majestic click. Jesus stands in the cold heart of the mountain, watching Jeff climb the spiral staircase carved into the living rock. He isn't looking at stock prices or delivery times anymore. He is looking at a clock that only ticks once a year, and whose cuckoo only sings once a millennium. He has built a monument not to his own name but to the concept of deep time. Back then, the world was obsessed with the Twitter second and the quarterly report. We lived in a frantic blur of the immediate, forgotten as soon as it happened. But Jeff? He was like a monk in a cathedral of gears trying to heal the human perspective. He spent $42 million not for a gadget but for a reminder that we are part of a story that began long before us and will continue long after we are dust. He realized that the greatest threat to humanity is short-term thinking, the greed that eats the future to satisfy the today. He planted a seed that the cynics called a billionaire's vanity, but the divine called it the prayer for the great-grandchildren. The critics laughed. Who will be there to see it? Why build something that lasts longer than nations? But Jesus smiled, because he knew the lesson of the mountain. To build for 10,000 years is an act of supreme humility, an admission that you are but a single breath in a divine symphony. For this final meditation, Jeff became the steward of the long now. He moved away from the neon lights of the city to the stillness of the high desert. He obsessed over the materials, titanium, ceramics, and stone that can survive the rise and fall of civilizations. He spent his nights thinking about the people of the year 12,000, hoping that when they find this clock, they will know that someone in the primitive 21st century cared enough about them to build a bridge across time. He was proving that true wealth is not what you accumulate, but the legacy of responsibility you leave behind. In the echoes of the mountain, as the chimes play a melody that will never repeat, the gears of intergenerational love started to click. It was a quiet revolution. It was a surrender to the infinite. Jeff was proving that a grain of wheat, if it is willing to be buried in the dark of a mountain, can mark the time for a harvest that won't happen for 100 lifetimes. The mountain is heavy and the desert is wide, but inside that rock, the man who built the everything store has finally found the one thing money cannot buy, the peace of the eternal. Today, on the deck of a sailing yacht that cuts through the blue silk of the Mediterranean, the sun catches the hard lines of a body rebuilt by iron and discipline. Jesus stands at the railing, looking at the horizon with him, watching Jeff, not the pale boy in the garage, but a man who has decided to master his own biology. He isn't just optimizing a website anymore. He is optimizing the human machine. He realized that all the wealth in the everything store cannot buy a single extra heartbeat, unless you are willing to fight for it. Back then, we thought aging was a cage we all had to accept. We thought the mind grew sharp while the body grew frail, and that was the end of the story. But Jeff, he is like a man who found the source code of his own vitality and decided to rewrite it. He invested billions into Altos Labs, chasing the secret of cellular rejuvenation, believing that death is just another friction that can be removed by a better system. He trades the soft life of a billionaire for the relentless hunger of an athlete, showing the world that day one isn't just a corporate motto, but a way to treat your own pulse. He planted a seed that the critics called the midlife crisis, but the divine called it the refusal to fade. They laughed at his muscles and his new life under the paparazzi's lens, but Jesus smiled because he knew the spirit of the pioneer. To explore the stars, one must first be a master of the temple he inhabits. Jeff isn't hiding from time, he is racing it. For this final transformation, Jeff became the architect of the new human. He shares his wealth with the Earth Fund, trying to heal the planet he once dominated, realizing that the long now requires a healthy garden to grow in. He spends his nights not in the boardroom but under the canopy of a life fully lived, blending the cold logic of the machine with the warm blood of a man who has finally learned how to breathe. He is proving that the ultimate connection isn't a logistics network, but the alignment of a man's will with the vast potential of the future. In the quiet power of his stride as he moves toward the next frontier, the gears of a new evolution started to click. It wasn't just about survival, it was about the intensity of being alive. Jeff was proving that a grain of wheat, if it refuses to wither, can become a forest that defies the seasons. The yacht moves forward and the stars begin to show, and the man who built the empire realized that the greatest prime delivery of all is the version of himself he is still becoming. 1 year ago, in a laboratory silent enough to hear the heartbeat of a single cell, the white light reflected off microscopes that were searching for the ghost in the machine. Jesus stood beside the scientists and the cold steel of the incubators, watching Jeff look through the lens at a future where age is just a variable to be reprogrammed. He wasn't looking for a cosmetic cure or a temporary fix. He was looking for the reset button of the human biological clock. He realized that the greatest friction in the universe is the slow, inevitable fading of the light. Back then, the world accepted mortality as the ultimate law, the one contract you couldn't negotiate. We lived in the shadow of the sunset, rushing to build our empires before the darkness came. But Jeff, he was like a coder looking at a corrupted file, refusing to let the data be lost. He gathered the greatest minds, the Nobel priests of biology, and gave them the gold of a king. To find the chemical spell that tells a cell to remember its youth, he spent his fortune not to buy time, but to invent a world where time no longer has the power to destroy the ones we love. He planted a seed that the skeptics called the fountain of hubris, but the divine called it the persistence of the spark. The critics whispered, "Is he afraid to die? Does he think he can outrun the scythe of the reaper?" But Jesus smiled because he knew the origin of the hunger. The desire to live forever is the faint echo of the home from which the soul first came. Jeff wasn't trying to be a god. He was trying to prove that the human project is never truly finished. For this biological revolution, Jeff became the architect of the eternal spring. He moved away from the logistics of boxes to the logistics of life itself, studying the Yamanaka factors with the same intensity he once gave to book deliveries. He spent his nights wondering if a grandfather's wisdom could be preserved in a body that never grows tired, believing that if we can fix a broken engine, we can fix a broken genome. He was proving that the ultimate innovation is not a gadget you hold in your hand, but the breath that stays in your lungs. In the quiet glow of the petri dishes where old cells began to dance like new, the gears of the great rejuvenation started to click. It wasn't a cry of fear, it was a shout of defiance. Jeff was proving that a grain of wheat, if it is willing to decode the secret of its own life, can refuse to return to the dust. The laboratory was cold, and the math was hard, but through that microscope, the man who mastered the earth was finally trying to master the biology of the soul. Today, standing at the summit of his life, where the view spans from the depth of the mountain to the edge of the galaxy, the silence is no longer filled with the noise of competition, but with the resonance of a life fully sown. Jesus stands at the threshold of the future, watching Jeff look back at the trail he has blazed through the wilderness of the impossible. He isn't counting his riches anymore. He is counting the dreams he has set in motion for generations he will never meet. He has become the architect of the infinite horizon. A man who realized that the greatest power of a pioneer is to open a door and walk away so that others may pass. Back then, we thought a legacy was a name carved in marble or a tower built of glass. We thought the measure of a man was how much he could take from the world. But Jeff? He is the one who proved that a legacy is a seed that outlives the sower. He didn't just build a company, he built a philosophy of day one, reminding us that no matter how much we have achieved, the sun is always just beginning to rise. He built the roads to space and the clocks in the stone, ensuring that humanity never stops looking up and never stops looking forward. He planted a seed that the history books will call the Amazon era, but the divine called it the awakening of the long view. But Jesus smiled, because he knew the completion of the soul. To labor for a future you will not inhabit is the highest form of love. For this final chapter, Jeff stands as a bridge between the finite and the eternal. He is the logistics king who mastered the earth, the star sailor who reached for the light, and the clockmaker who befriended the centuries. He has proven that you can build an empire of silicon and steel without losing the fire of the visionary. He knew one thing: we are the ancestors of a civilization that hasn't even begun to dream yet. In the quiet echo of his footsteps as he moves into the sunset of his own story, the gears of eternal pioneering start to click with a rhythm that sounds like a promise. The merchant has become a philosopher. The builder has become a guardian. And Jeff stands at the edge of the blue planet, a man who taught the world that the only way to predict the future is to have the courage to build it. The boxes are delivered and the rockets have flown, but under Jeff's stewardship, the heart of humanity has finally learned to beat in time with the stars.